Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Moderator. Thank you also for the organizer for inviting us to this symposium. International human rights law, as with the setting up of the United Nations, at the end of Second World War, promised the dignity and worth of humans in both large and small nations. International human rights law was supposed to save the world population from scourge of war, despots, and other miseries. The international legal order after the end of Second World War also promised equal sovereignty where all states would be equal under international law in spite of inequality of population size, resources, military might, and others. International human rights law is thus applicable to all states to protect all population. The following discussion looks at the experience of Malaysia accepting the universality of international human rights law, but at the same time affirming that the distinct character of the nation with its indigenous culture and norms. First, look at the promise of the international human rights law. The suffering of the people after the Second World War convinced the world of the need for a shared code of conduct, recognizing inalienable human rights. To prevent another world war, there is also need to have an international body like the United Nations to keep the world peace. Initially, the United States and United Kingdom were reluctant to place human rights as the central theme of the United Nations in the proposal suggested in the Dumbarton Oaks Conference 1944, fearing that their treatment of colored people and their colonies, respectively, would be questioned. Nevertheless, in June 1945, Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations put one of the purposes of the United Nations is to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, gender, language, or religion. Furthermore, on 10th December 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris, setting out the standards for human rights as inalienable rights of all members of the human family, as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace. Next, we look at the Malaysian accepting the treaties. Immediately after being accepted as a member of the United Nations, after its independence in 1957, Malaysia has embraced in general the importance of human rights. This is reflected in some of the speeches of its first ambassador to the United States and permanent representative to the United Nations. Although Malaysia has not extended a warm embrace to the whole idea of international human rights, as shown by criticism from its leader, including criticisms from Mahathir Mohamad, the longest reigning Prime Minister, and the first person who became Prime Minister for the second time in 2018. Malaysia, as a sovereign country, has ratified several treaties, including the Convention on the Rights of Children in 1995, resulted in the enactment of the Child Act 2001, and the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities on the 6th July 2010. Another convention ratified is the Convention on the Elimination of All Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. Malaysia has shown its commitment to the treaty by taking appropriate measures to ensure the advancement of women. For instance, express prohibition of gender discrimination was inserted in the Federal Constitution in 2001. And the Ministry for Women and Family Community Development was established on the 17th January 2001. Now we look at the Malaysian government and cultural relativism. As indicated above, Malaysia has always stated its reservation to the idea of international human rights, particularly in its idea of universalism. Although Malaysia subscribed to the idea of international human rights, its implementation should always consider the local culture and norms. In other words, cultural relativism. Mahathir Mohamad, while he was the Prime Minister of Malaysia for the first time between 1981 and 2003, criticized the imposition of Western values in particular the liberal notion of human rights over the Asian values. He argued that the application of human rights should take into account Asian values, which in the context of Malaysia emphasize the Malay Islamic values. Other Asian leaders from Singapore and Indonesia, for instance, also share the idea of cultural relativism and Asian values with a different emphasis from Mahathir Mohamad. Such misgiving of Eurocentrism and Western dominance in value setting is reflected in Malaysia making reservation while ratifying CEDAW, for instance. However, Malaysia did review its reservation and withdrew some reservation, which I detail out in my paper. The remaining reservation, particularly under Article 16, relate to laws applicable to Muslim. For instance, under Malaysian law, generally there is no total freedom to choose a spouse, since Muslim could not marry non-Muslim. Similarly, even though it could be argued that Muslim men and women have equal substantive rights in marriage and dissolution of marriage, the exact instrument available for the two sexes are not similar. The initial reservation and subsequent withdrawal of it shows the acceptance of Malaysia to the principle of non-discrimination. However, since the understanding of equality differs and sometimes not holistic, Malaysia has maintained its reservation. Perhaps at this juncture, the call for dialogue among civilizations to achieve universalism in international human rights law is pertinent. The United Nations' recognition of the diverse civilizational achievement of mankind, crystallizing cultural pluralism and creative human diversity, shows the reality of pluralism and consequently cultural relativism. Distinction then had to be made between universality of international human rights law, which refers to the universal quality or global acceptance of the human rights idea, with the universalism in human rights, which requires interpretation and application of human rights idea. Then we look at the Malaysian courts and doctrine of dualism. Some reluctance to accept readily provisions in international human rights instrument could be seen in the domestic application of international treaties in the Malaysian legal system. In dispute before the courts, parties have attempted to argue that international instruments should be used in interpreting and applying domestic law. However, an obstacle to this argument is the doctrine of dualism, where municipal law and international law are considered existing in separate legal system. Thus, international law could not apply directly in the municipal legal system without first being incorporated domestically through legislation. Then I go to the conclusion. This paper seeks to analyze the experience of Malaysia in taking hold of international human rights law in a conditional embrace. The UDHR, as a part of the International Bill of Rights under the United Nations, by the name itself proclaims to be universal and seeks out to be a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. However, the abstention of 8 member states, for instance, shows not fail of universalization, but of divergent interpretation of the rights. Taking CEDAW as the main examples of the Malaysian experience, one could see the commitment of the executive and the legislature to implement and incorporate its provision. However, there were reservations with the belief that the indigenous norms and culture should matter in the application of human rights. With the end of the rule of Barisan Nasional, the main coalition political parties forming the government of Malaysia, which ruled for 61 years, continuous rule since the independence, replaced by Pakatan Harapan, a new coalition formed before the 14th general election. Subsequent to the completion of the 14th general election in May 2018, questions were raised as to the approach that will be taken by the new government. The new government seems to be more eager to ratify the remaining 6 human rights treaties as declared by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. This is reaffirmed by the Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad in delivering Malaysian national statement at the 73rd United Nations General Assembly's General Debate, where he pledged that the new government of Malaysia is to ratify the remaining core United Nations instrument on human rights. Nevertheless, he reminded the Assembly that it would not be easy as Malaysia is multi-ethnic, multi-religions, and multicultural and multilingual. Thus, it appears that although the new government is more predisposed to accept international human rights, the doubt about its universalism lingers. The new government still reiterates the need to consider indigenous culture and norms so that small nations from the South would not be overwhelmed by values whose universality are accepted, but whose application requires indigenous interpretation. Thank you.